Welcome to the Rustic Songbird podcast. I'm your host, Lydia Walker, and this is episode number 35. On this episode, I interview Robby Valderrama about the need for diversity in our churches, and specifically how songwriters and musicians can impact the music by serving in the local church. Robby is the host of the Praise Hands podcast and offers resources and advice for forward-thinking Christian leaders at thechurchahead.org. Before we begin today's interview, I wanted to let you know that I've created a checklist for you if you're interested in recording your own songs in a studio. I've made a checklist about how to prepare your songs to record in a studio, how to find the right producer for you, and what information you'll need to send to them. So all of that is in one download that you can get by going to rusticsongbird.com/checklist. That's rusticsongbird.com/checklist for how to prepare to record in a studio. All right, my guest on the show today is Robby Valderrama. Robby, thank you for taking the time to be on the show today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. It's such a treat to be here. I think what you're doing is great, just being able to empower people through songwriting and let people share their different voices on the topic. And I'm excited to get to speak about this aspect of diversity in worship.
Yes, I think it's such an important conversation to have. And before we jump into that, would you quickly introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little about your family and your background? I'd love for you to share some of your story.
Yeah, well, my name is Robby, and my wife and I, we live here in the Nashville area of Tennessee, and we are originally from the Bay Area in California, San Jose area, and moved out here. God spoke really specifically to us about 4 years ago and said, you guys are moving, and we prayed on it and moved out in November of 2015, and it's been such a joy. We get to still keep in touch with everybody in California and go back a handful of times per year, and really, my passion is a couple things. Obviously, God and family, and those are the most important things to me. And in terms of fleshing out ministry and what I feel, the different lanes that God's given me to run in, it's typically music, local church ministry, and finance. And so those are the areas that I've always kind of been involved with. And when you go to and talk to people, they're like, all right, you got to focus on one thing. And that's never worked for me. And so I've kind of found my lanes, if you will. And it's been so much fun to see God kind of even cross-pollinate between those and use each of those to speak into each other in really weird ways. But it's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. I appreciate you sharing a little bit about the family and where you come from. I'd like to just jump in with this question. What do you see as the biggest need for diversity in the modern Christian worship music, and where do you see it going from here? I'd like to hear your take on it from your perspective.
Yeah, so, well, I think before maybe talking about where it's going, it might be useful to talk about where it is. And
yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, and before we talk about where it is, it might be helpful to talk about where we've come from. And that's kind of one of the things that's a part of my story is looking at how I just kind of started noticing, moving from California to Nashville, and specifically from the Bay Area to this part of Tennessee, I knew that I was leaving one of the least churched areas in the country and going to one of the most churched. And I didn't make the connection that there would be a correlation between that and also being moving from one of the least racially segregated to one of the most racially segregated. And so coming out here to Nashville, I really started thinking, man, either my understanding of the cross-cultural heart of God and of all the stories in the Bible is really, really off, or we're missing something as a church. And so that got me on this journey of really researching and where have we come from, where are we, and like you said, where are we going? And so in terms of the music of the church, it's always been I think a really important part of the expression of the church, as one scholar, Rob puts it, worship is the prime identity creating space for the church. And so throughout history, I think, and you have the, I forget the Latin, like Lexi Creedi or something like that. It's basically worship shapes believing that Glenn Packham has talked about, and looking at the liturgical, looking at some of the more like mystical, all these different aspects of Christian tradition have really shaped the church's belief in who God is. And I think coming from the context that we've come from with the American church, specifically the white evangelical church, there's been a lot of influence from a highly Christianized culture in Europe. And what we've done is we've brought that over, and it's kind of been, we kind of can assume that everybody needs to be like us in the way that they do things. And I'm not talking about core theological convictions, but in terms of cultural expressions, it's been one of these things where that's been the normative expression, is whatever we choose to do as the white Christian church, and the way that other people do it is kind of like the other. And so I think, an example of that would be if we're talking about inner city ministry, we have to put a modifier before it, or a Hispanic ministry, we put, it's Hispanic ministry, or urban ministry, or any of these sort of things. But if it's to a white demographic, we don't tend to put a modifier before it because it's just ministry. And so looking at that lens of ministry, when you look at how the music of the church has developed alongside of that, it's kind of just played right into that narrative of white normativity, if you will. And so when it's you're a small town in Kansas or whatever, that the whole town is white, that's not really a big deal. That doesn't really hurt anybody, or that's fine. But when society gets more globalized, that can have some interesting ramifications. So in terms of the creativity of the church and the music of the church, I think that where we're at today is a spot where we have been used to the ways that we've done things, and in a lot of cases the Christian church has been isolated from the rest of culture. And so a lot of the trends that have emerged in broader culture, if you walk into a Target, you're probably going to see much greater diversity than you would on a Sunday morning. And so I think that's definitely affected the worship of the church as well. And I think we could benefit from expanding that lens a little bit.
Definitely. And I've grown up in the Nashville area, and I've seen that we have plenty of different types of people represented in our city, in our area. And one of my friends, Erskine, he has been on the show before, has a song called Black and White, and it says the most segregated time in America is Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock. Because you've got black churches and white churches and Hispanic churches, and there's no other segregation like that outside of the church right now. So I'm like, how can we break out of this and move towards change where different people are represented? And it doesn't have to be equal for every race, but like you said, just people represented, people having I don't know, we'll talk about this, but like just being inclusive and not being all the same. And so what I really like to ask you is, like, what do you see as the biggest need for diversity right now?
Yeah, I think a helpful framework is that our churches should be reflective of, they should be like an indigenous mix of the people that live there. And so part of the problem, and I thought about this a lot, and I thought, man, this is a problem. I started asking myself, why if you look at all the posters or whatever of worship artists, they're all white. And there's nothing wrong with white people. There's nothing wrong with white male people. There's nothing wrong with white male people that have more money than other people. But when that's the only demographic that's represented over and over again, it sends a message, whether we like it or not, to people that are not any of those demographics, that you're not that, and this is what's normal, and you're not normal for worship music. And so I think that has affected the definition really of Christian with our culture. And so I'd say, if I had to pinpoint something that I'm really trying to work on, is really changing that definition of Christian. Because if you look at if you look at a couple things, if you look at the early church, and specifically in Antioch, where the term Christian was first used, that word originally had diverse connotations. Before the church of Antioch, the Christian church, they were known as like followers of the way, and kind of that crazy Jewish sect of people that follow Jesus. When it came to Antioch, it was a multicultural city. And so it was really a multicultural church plant there, with people from North Africa, with Jewish backgrounds, with Greek backgrounds. And that was the leadership team of people light-skinned and dark-skinned of that team. And so the city around them started saying, man, what is this group? We can't just call them the crazy Jews. We have to come up with a name for them. It's the Christians. And so that's the heritage of that term of Christian. And the problem, I'd say one of the biggest things that we're trying to tackle is recovering that diverse heritage of the term Christian. And I think one of the problems that we have is the words that we use. When we say Christian music, what we typically mean is white contemporary Christian music. And when we say gospel music, we typically mean black gospel music. And I don't think that white people have the corner on the word Christian, and I don't think black people have the corner on the word gospel. And so I prefer the terms white CCM and black gospel music because we are all Christian and we all sing about the gospel. And that's no disrespect to any of the cultures and to the backgrounds, but I think that the words that we use kind of define the playing fields, and we are all one church. And so it's important that the words that we use reflect that. So specifically, excuse me, when it comes to big challenges, I think that was your question, right? What was the...
Yeah, what do you see as the biggest need right now?
Yeah, I think it's to get our congregations to the place. Oh yeah. So what I was getting at, now I remembered my train of thought, was after researching kind of that heritage of the word Christian, I started asking, what could be done about this, right? To be able to see change happen. And my first thought was, man, we just need more examples of diverse Christian music or diverse gospel music, however you want to put it. We need people to see what it looks like. And I think that's a very important part of the puzzle. But what I realized is that there's something called systemic forces. And you could also put it in the biblical language of principalities, however you want to put it. But there are forces that are in place, I would say definitely economically, and also even in terms of how we relate to each other in the disunity in the church, that even if, let's say I start an amazing, diverse Christian worship group, and it goes for 5 or 10 years and gains a lot of traction, there are underlying forces. It's like the tide, if it's moving in one direction, then it's, even if you swim against it for a long time, eventually the next person that comes down, if they don't swim as fast as you, they're just going to be swept along with the tide as well. And so some of those systemic forces, I would say, if you look at the way that the church's creativity is funded, there is segregation embedded in that. And specifically with our local churches, if they don't reflect, you can't have multicultural worship without multicultural churches. And so if you just try to create multicultural worship, but there's not a continuous mechanism to systemically and culturally be churning that out, the next generation that doesn't capture that vision is going to lose that. And similarly with the economic situation, we tend to get our funding sources within the church from denominational means as opposed to location-based means. And what that means is you have church planners that will specifically sign up for a denomination just because there's funding sources. And I talked to one friend that they were considering switching their church's denomination just to be able to get a discount. Actually, I talked to several friends who are switching their church's denomination just to get a discount on seminary. And wow. So the economic side of things matters as well. And so what I realized is in order to sustainably and systemically change the creativity of the church to be cross-cultural, the churches have to be desegregated, and also there has to be a funding source that is rooted in local communities that is able to fund this sustainably. So I would say, zooming back in, I think we need to address both, yes, the musical aspects of it, and and worship leaders and songwriters have an important role in doing that. But even in terms of the terms that we use, worship leader, that if worship leader equals, a song, a mimicker that, it wasn't written by your local community, and in most cases doesn't reflect your local community. That's, again, an example of the words that we use limiting the playing field. It implies that worship is just music, and it implies that leadership is just spiritual. And really, as worship leaders, we should be focusing on worship that's 24/7, and that affects all of our lives. And as leaders, we should look at not just the spiritual, but also the financial, also the physical, all those different aspects of life. And so in ways, I'll just maybe pack a couple ideas. Musically, I think we can make sure that the people that are at the table writing the songs are from diverse backgrounds. And one of the reasons why this is important from an economic perspective, if your song is played on K-Love or whatever radio station, and you're the artist, but you didn't write the song, you don't get any money from that. You get it if you're a songwriter on that, but you don't get any money if you're just the artist. And so even if you look at the racial connotations of that, even if you have a person of color that's the artist on a song, but it wasn't written by someone from that demographic, then you actually have basically someone's skin color being used to fund an economic engine that actually doesn't benefit that community. And so it's important that we invite people of color or from whatever demographic is not being represented to the table to actually be a part of creating those songs and share in the reward for those. And that, I think, creates a sense of equality that reflects the kingdom of God. So that's musically, I think, in terms of our local congregations. I think it's important that our local congregations are intentional about stating a multicultural focus, because if we're not putting that out as a part of our mission, then it won't survive budget meetings. Only things that are really a core part of your mission will actually survive budget meetings when things get tough. You find out what you really believe. And I think that a lot of times multiculturalism or diversity is this kind of nice concept. And maybe we'll try to get people of color on stage. But then when push comes to shove, it's like, well, we're not actually going to let that person be like the leader, because that's not really who our church is. And the core of our church, the shareholders of our church, the people that are really giving the most or are most socially connected are not from that demographic. And we can't really let that happen and let it go too far. But if it's a part of your mission, then someone's skin color or someone's cultural competence is actually is important for qualifying them for the job. And it's not just this affirmative action thing of, all right, this person's more qualified, but we got to let this other person in. It's like, no, let's redefine what competency and qualification looks like from the lens of an intentional multicultural church. And then economically, I think we can be generating local sources of wealth to fund kingdom work, so we're less dependent upon maybe denominational structures or overly industrialized music systems that maybe undermine the local creativity of the church. So that was a lot, but that's my full answer. You can process that a little bit.
I'm taking notes. I'm going to be sharing some of this in the show notes as well. But I love some of the wording that you're saying, because it is deeper rooted issues than just the music of the church. And we do have these terms that we just use and don't think about it. But I think once you start asking yourself those questions of why are we doing this a certain way, is there a better way? How do we include other people and actually make it beneficial to represent our community? I love that you brought that up, that when we're singing songs that are maybe on the radio, they're not necessarily representing the people in our church and in our community. And so just making that connection, I think, is really powerful. And more churches, more worship teams are writing their own music, which is great, because it has a different flavor based on the people that are in the group and how they grew up and what styles they like and what they listen to. And that's way different than what you'll hear on the radio most of the time.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that is awesome. I'm making notes. I think it's really important because once you start asking those questions, then you're more aware.
Right.
Then you start seeing things and you're like, wait a minute, that's
Mm-hmm.
not quite how it should be.
Yeah.
And so then you start asking the questions of, well, how can I be a part of the positive change towards growth and towards cultivating a better, healthier local church? And so I know that music is just a part of that, and
Right.
there's so much that goes into it, but I do appreciate that you brought up the funding as well, because we have to put the money where our mouth is
Right.
and really invest in what we want it to look like. And so as far as putting money in the budget for reaching out to our community,
Mm-hmm.
for like you said, the songwriting, I think that's super important, not just the artist, but I'm just repeating kind of what you said.
Mm-hmm.
Having different types of people in the songwriting room, people on our worship teams writing songs for the churches.
Right.
So I think that's just a practical way to start towards a healthier, growing church.
And I'll interject something here. And some people listening to this might say, "Man, well, I don't really know a lot of people that aren't from the same cultural background as me, because birds of a feather tend to flock together." And they might be wondering, do I just go on Craigslist and say, "Hey, are there any Hispanic worship songwriters in my area?" You could do that. I don't know how effective that would be, but you can look through maybe Facebook groups on worship leaders, or even just literally drive to another church in town that looks different. You knock on the door and say, "Hey, I want to connect with some of my brothers and sisters in Christ," or maybe find some people in your church that are from a different cultural background than you, and just ask, "Hey, what's it like to be from your cultural background in our church?" And a really important aspect of this is just developing friendship with people that don't look like you. And I think that's a life practice. And yes. I think it's important to be humble. And one of the challenges that we can have is a lot of times it's easier just to go with what we've always done. And it takes a certain amount of kind of sucking up our pride to say, "Hey, maybe I don't totally have it figured out, and I can learn something from people that are different than me." And if we're not careful, we can get threatened by that. And we can get threatened and feel like, "Oh man, if I don't have that all figured out, what else do I not have figured out?" But I think that when we take that posture of humility, we're not making concessions, but we're just being open. And I think that God can use that in amazing ways.
Yes, I agree. I think personally it's overwhelming to me. How do I fix it? How do I be a part of the change? Where do I even start? And thinking, what can one person or one church do towards such a bigger issue in our culture? But I do believe that it's lots of little things that add up to a bigger change.
And specific ideas. This is getting really ground level. Is like I said, songwriting with people that are different than you. Also, just for what you yourself listen to, try to find out what's out there that's written from people from different backgrounds. You can also support an organization like Praise Hands, and we're a nonprofit organization, and be able to fund that, and that goes towards creative cross-cultural music, and also find other organizations that are out there that for example, the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. There's a network of churches called the Mosaic that are intentional, multicultural, multi-ethnic churches. And so just getting connected with some of the resources that are already out there. There's probably someone in your town that's already trying to do this. And it's just more a matter of connecting with them and being encouraged and being equipped for the long run.
Yes. I would love to hear more about how you started the Praise Hands nonprofit and the Praise Hands podcast, and kind of how people can listen and get connected with what you're doing.
Yeah, so out of kind of a lot of that process of moving here and seeing, man, it's so racially segregated, and just the church is even more so than the rest of the culture, out of a desire to see change in that, I started asking those questions and looking at the economics, looking at the way we do church, and all these different kind of systemic forces, and saying, okay, well, what do we do? And I realized that the first logical step is really just to start talking about it and bring some education, because like I didn't know a lot of this stuff before I started asking these questions. And, I never want to just start like talking to people that are maybe where I was a couple of years ago and saying, hey, you should already be here, because I wasn't there a couple of years ago. And so I think a
Right.
great first step is to just start asking some questions, and specifically within the Praise Hands podcast, the goal is to highlight creative cross-cultural solutionists, whether they're inside the church or not inside the church, that we can all learn from, and specifically solutionists that are creating the future of church, race, music, economics, and technology, basically creating the future landscape of this discussion. And if there's someone that is listening to this podcast that's like, man, I want to see change happen in this area, and I'm in this aspect of society or this aspect of society, I would rather them be able to listen to one of the podcast episodes that I record and bring in somebody that's been doing this for 20 years that asked that same question 20 years ago and has already learned from 15 years of mistakes and then finally figured out maybe a good way to do it. I'd rather you learn from them and save yourself 10 or 15 years of doing it the wrong way, or a way that you'd regret, and be able to just be that much further ahead with what you're trying to do. So that's why we started the podcast and the broader nonprofit. We've got some longer term initiatives that we're working towards, and the podcast is really just a first step towards that.
That's so exciting. Well, I want to encourage our listeners. You're already listening to podcasts, so go over and subscribe to the Praise Hands podcast. You've already got several episodes up already and more coming, and so this is a weekly show. Tell me a little bit about what's coming up next in the next few months.
Yeah, so we are seasonal, and what that means is kind of on the academic year, like a spring semester and a fall semester, and we've got some incredible stuff lined up for the fall. We've got, I'll share just some examples on the topic that are closely related to the topic of church and worship, which is what we're talking about today. One of the churches that we interviewed is called Tapestry Church, and they are out in Oakland, California, not too far from where I'm from. And a couple of years ago, there was a black church and there was a white church, and they both started feeling called to be able to be in greater community. So they started fellowshipping together, not being the same church, but just being in community and being engaged with the local city together. And then Charlottesville happened, and you had rioting going on, you had all sorts of things going on, and protests and parades and all these things. And the pastor of the black church and the pastor of the white church got together and said, we need to actually merge our churches to show the city what it looks like to be the kingdom of God, and to show people that the cross has an answer for this. And so they actually merged their churches, and that church is now called Tapestry Church. And so in that episode that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks on the podcast, you're going to be able to hear their story of how they started, of some of the things that they've walked through, of some advice that they would give to people that are trying to be intentional about, all the things that we've talked about. Another really fascinating story is the Church of Crossroads Church in the Cincinnati/Kentucky area. And this church started out of a Procter & Gamble, actually. It was a bunch of people that were businessmen, and they said, you know what, we know that the people here at our work would never come to the churches we go to. And they said, that's not okay. We can't, if we are making a concession and saying, well, sorry, that's a problem. And so they actually put their own money on the line. I think some of them mortgaged their own houses to actually start this church. And now I think in their Easter services, they had like 80 or 90,000 people come on a weekend to their services. Wow. And I told my wife, Bria, who and I told her, I think this is probably the most impressed I've ever been with how a church is actually engaging its local community. And so some examples of what they've done, they started something called the City Link Center. And what they did is they got a piece of property, and then they asked a lot of the really tough questions about the problems affecting their city. And then what they did is they found the best nonprofits from each link of the chain, and then they let them all come into that building so that there could be a one-stop shop for people that are wanting to get their life together. And that includes spiritual growth, that includes social, financial, all those different aspects. And they can come in, get a dedicated case manager. And they shared a story of a lady who came in, and was homeless, didn't have a job, was just like, I need to get my life together. 9 months later, she had $4,000 in the bank. She was like, I don't know what to do with all this money. She had a steady job, steady living situation. And the reason she was able to get there was because this church created solutions in their local area. And I think this church, what's interesting is that they call it, I think, either multi or interdenominational, and that they're willing to put aside some of the preference-based things or maybe lower priority theological items to be able to work together to serve their city and to be in fellowship. And I think that really inspires me to see a church that's willing to do that and is really affecting and integrated with the social fabric of its city. So those are a couple things. We're also interviewing somebody who has the world's first church that's entirely in virtual reality. And that's going to be a fascinating conversation. A lot of really cool stuff coming up.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate your time. And I'm just so excited for what's happening with your podcast and with the ministry, and I'm really enjoying following along with it, and just wanted to share it with more people and be a part of the movement. So I appreciate you being on the show, Robby.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Lydia. I appreciate what you're doing to equip songwriters to really make an impact wherever they are, and I hope that people learned something from this that they can take away, and if nothing else, maybe start some wheels turning and really be able to be more effective building the kingdom.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, that was such a great conversation with Robby, and I hope that you enjoyed listening today and got something out of it. I hope it sparked some ideas. You can connect with Robby at thechurchahead.org. Remember to download your free copy of my checklist for how to prepare to record in a studio. You can go to rusticsongbird.com/checklist. That's rusticsongbird.com/checklist. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please consider subscribing so you don't miss an episode. Also, if you could just take 1 minute to rate or review this podcast, it makes a big difference. Thanks so much for listening. Till next time.